Montana, winter, 1872. The cellar was flooding. The barn roof was caving in. And the only person brave enough to run into that fire was drowning in the dark below. Gideon dropped in without hesitation. His hands found her. He hauled her up onto frozen ground, pulled her hard against his chest, and felt her clothes, rigid with ice, soaked straight through to skin. Dammit's voice cracked wide open. Jasper froze. Thorne couldn't speak. Rhett turned away so nobody would see his face. Nobody expected a woman from Boston with one old trunk and $43 to walk into the hardest corner of the frontier and make four iron-willed mountain men feel something they thought was gone forever. The story starts right below. You're not going to want to read this alone. The whistle split the air like a blade. Maeve Hollister pressed her palm flat against the cold train window and stared out at a world that looked nothing like Boston. No cobblestones, no gas lamps lining tidy brownstone streets. Just gray sky, gray mud, and the skeletal frames of a frontier town clawing itself up out of the frozen earth. Black Moccasin, Montana. She had imagined it differently. She always did that, built a picture in her head before she arrived somewhere, filled in the colors, got it wrong. The picture she'd built of this place had mountains in it, yes, but also sunlight, clean air, promise. What she got instead was sleet. The locomotive shuddered to a stop with a groan of iron and steam, and Maeve gathered her skirts, checked that her father's trunk was still secured in the luggage car, and stepped down onto the platform. Her boot sank straight into the mud. She pulled it free with a wet, ugly sound and kept moving, because that was the only thing left to do. The hem of her white dress, her mother's dress, altered twice, worn today because the contract had specified a proper bridal presentation, dragged through the slush, and came up dark. She watched it happen and decided not to care. The dress was a formality. Everything about today was a formality. The train depot was a single plank building with a tin roof and a hand-painted sign that someone had misspelled and corrected twice. A few men in canvas coats and mud-caked boots stood under the awning, watching her with open curiosity, the way people in small places watch strangers, like she was news and maybe trouble. She straightened her spine. She had her father's books. She had his maps, though she didn't fully understand them yet. She had $43, a list of his debts, and a signed marriage contract with a man named Gideon Blackwood, whom she had never met. That was what she had. It would have to be. Enough, Miss Hollister. The voice came from her left, low, controlled, with no warmth in it whatsoever. She turned. He was taller than she expected. Broader, the kind of man who filled a doorway and made the doorway look smaller. Dark coat, dark hat, a jaw set so hard it could have been quarried from the same rock the mountains were made of. His eyes were steady on her face, pale gray and unreadable, and there was a scar at his collar, just the edge of it, disappearing beneath his shirt, wide and old and brutal. Gideon Blackwood looked like a man who had survived something terrible and come out the other side. Not healed but hardened. Mr. Blackwood, she said. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at the mud on her hem, then back at her face, and something shifted behind his eyes, not sympathy exactly, more like assessment. The trunk, he said. That everything? That's everything. He gave a short nod and turned toward the luggage car. Behind him, she noticed the other three for the first time. They'd been standing back, giving him space, but they were watching her closely. A giant of a man with arms like oak branches and the gentlest eyes she'd ever seen on a human being. A lean, weathered man with a slight drag to his left leg and the stillness of someone who had learned to go very quiet in dangerous places. A younger man, sharp-featured and composed, with the look of someone accustomed to thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Jasper, Thorne, Rhett. She had read their names in the contract. She had not expected them to be real yet. Rhett stepped forward first and touched the brim of his hat. Rhett Montgomery, ma'am. You had a long journey. I did, she agreed. Was it terrible? She considered lying. Parts of it, she said instead, and he almost smiled. Jasper moved next, ducking his head in a motion that looked almost shy on a man his size. Jasper Mercer, welcome to Montana. Thorne simply looked at her from beneath the shadow of his hat brim and said nothing. But he gave her a single slow nod that felt, somehow, like a complete sentence. Gideon returned with the trunk, balanced on one shoulder, like it weighed nothing. He set it in the wagon bed with a care that surprised her, careful with the corners, careful with the latch. She filed that away. Nobody spoke much on the ride out. The land opened up beyond town and became something else entirely. Vast, indifferent, beautiful in a way that didn't care whether you appreciated it or not. The mountains sat against the horizon, enormous and permanent, dusted with snow at the peaks. Pine forests draped the lower slopes like dark green cloth. The sky above them was the color of iron. Maeve sat in the wagon with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap and tried to memorize all of it, because her father had always said that observation was the first act of education. You can't understand a place until you look at it. Honestly, he used to say. Really look, not just glance. She missed him. She missed him the way you miss something that held your whole life together. Quietly, constantly, like a splinter you'd stop noticing except in certain moments. He'd been a school teacher, 30 years in the same Boston classroom, shaping children who would go on to do things he'd never get to see. He died with debts she hadn't known about, left her a homestead she couldn't keep without help, and tucked a trunk full of books and strange, detailed maps into her custody, without quite explaining why. The why was becoming clearer slowly. She was still working on it. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, breaking the silence. He didn't look at her, but his shoulders shifted slightly. "Listening. I need to understand the terms of this arrangement before we arrive. They're in the contract. I know what's in the contract. I'd like to hear what you actually mean by it." A pause. The horses moved steadily on. "This is a business arrangement," he said finally. His voice was flat and deliberate, like he was reading from something he'd written and memorized. "You manage the ledgers. You teach the local children. We protect the land." He glanced at her then, just briefly, just long enough for her to see the wall behind his eyes. No romance. No touching. She met his gaze for exactly as long as was necessary. "Understood. Good. Then you'll understand my condition as well." That made him look at her again longer this time. She thought she caught the faintest flicker of surprise. She turned in the wagon seat to face him more fully. The cold wind pulled at her hair. The mountains rose behind her like witnesses. "I will keep your ledgers and I will teach your children," she said. "But I'll be opening a proper schoolhouse, not just for ranch children. For every child in this valley who wants an education, poor farm families, children whose parents work the mines, indigenous youth from the surrounding land." She paused. "All of them. That is my condition. That is the only thing I require in return for everything this contract asks of me, and it is not negotiable." The silence that followed was long enough that she started to wonder if she'd miscalculated. Jasper made a low sound beside Rhett, something quiet and warm. Rhett was watching Gideon with an expression she couldn't read yet. Thorne's eyes were on the road ahead, but his jaw had changed. Gideon looked at her for another long moment, then he faced forward. "Fine," he said. "Just that. Fine. One word." But Maeve had spent her life in classrooms, surrounded by children who hadn't yet learned to hide what they felt. She knew the difference between agreement and defeat, and she knew the difference between indifference and a man working very hard to appear indifferent. Gideon Blackwood was not indifferent. She turned back toward the road. The wagon wheels ground on through the frozen mud. Ahead, Timber Ridge Ranch crouched at the foot of the mountain, dark and austere, stone and timber, a structure built for function rather than comfort. It looked like a fortress. She thought of her father's books. She thought of what knowledge could do in a place where people had been told for years that they didn't deserve it. She thought of a child sitting at a rough-hewn desk for the first time and feeling, maybe for the first time, that someone believed they were worth teaching. That was why she had come, not for Gideon Blackwood's contract, not to be managed or saved or kept. She had come because her father had taught her that the most powerful thing you can give a human being is the belief that their mind matters, their life matters, that they have value not because of where they were born or who their parents were, but because they exist thinking, feeling, reaching. A woman in a muddy white dress, riding into the Montana cold with $43 and a trunk full of books. She had been underestimated before. She didn't mind. The ranch at night was a different animal entirely. During the ride in, Maeve had cataloged it with a practical eye: the stone foundation, the split-rail fencing, the smokehouse standing apart from the main structure. Solid construction, well-maintained. The work of men who understood that things fell apart if you didn't pay constant attention. But after dark, Timber Ridge became something else. The wind got into the eaves and stayed there, pressing against the timber walls with a low, steady moan. The fire in the main hearth threw long shadows across the floorboards. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. Gideon had shown her to a room at the end of the east corridor. Small but clean. A narrow bed, a wash basin, a window that looked out toward the pine forest. He'd set her trunk beside the door without comment and left without saying goodnight. She hadn't expected him to. She unpacked what she needed, washed her face, changed out of the ruined white dress, and told herself she would sleep. She did not sleep. She lay on her back and listened to the ranch settle around her. Boots on floorboards somewhere above. The creak of a rocking chair from the direction of the main room. Rhythmic and slow. Wind. Always the wind. Then, sometime past midnight, she heard it. A voice, low and fractured, rising from somewhere down the hall. Not words, exactly, more like the sound of words trying to form and failing, trapped somewhere between sleep and waking. She sat up. The sound came again, sharp this time, almost a shout, then cut off abruptly. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and opened her door. The hall was dark. She followed the sound to a door 3 rooms down and stood outside it, listening. Silence now, but thick, the kind that comes after something loud. She pressed her fingertips lightly to the wood. Inside, a man was fighting his way back from somewhere she couldn't follow. Thorn. She knew it without seeing him. Something in the particular quality of that sound, the way it had edges on it, like old metal. She stood there for a moment, not opening the door, not walking away. Then she went back to her room, filled the small clay cup on her wash basin with water, and left it outside his door. It was all she could offer a stranger in the dark. She was almost back to her own room when she heard the second sound. This one came from outside. She went to her window and looked out toward the forge. A low stone building set back from the main house, with a banked fire still glowing faintly through the iron grate. There was a light in there, and within it, a silhouette Jasper, sitting on a stool, shoulders caved forward, arms resting on his knees, head bowed. He wasn't working. She watched him for a long moment. His stillness was total. A man that large taking up so little space. It was the posture of grief, and she recognized it the way you recognize a word in a foreign language you've only half learned. Her father had sat like that in the months after her mother died. She let the curtain fall. She didn't go outside. Some grief required witnesses, and some grief required privacy, and she was not yet in a position to know which kind his was. In the morning, she would learn the house. She rose before dawn and moved quietly through the main rooms, while the others were still sleeping. The kitchen was sparse but functional. The main room held a long plank table, 6 chairs, a rifle rack that was fully stocked and carefully maintained. Books on a shelf by the fire. She crossed to them automatically, the way she always did. Legal texts, survey manuals, a well-worn Bible, a child's primer, small and thin, tucked behind the others. She pulled it out gently. The cover was faded, blue cloth, the corners soft with handling. Inside the front page, someone had written a name in careful, deliberate letters: Clara, age 6. She closed it and put it back exactly where she'd found it. She moved further through the house and discovered the locked room by accident, a door near the back of the east wing that didn't open when she tried it. Not unusual. But through the gap beneath the door, she could see the corner of a small wooden rocking horse and the bright, faded color of a child's quilt. She stepped back from it. On the work desk in the main room, left in plain sight, under a lamp, was a ledger. She opened it, expecting ranch accounts. What she found instead were columns of names and figures: the Hendersons, the Abernathy family, A widow named Cora Mills, a family she didn't recognize with 6 entries spread across 3 years. Each entry showed a debt paid, quietly, completely. No signatures requested. Gideon Blackwood had been paying off poor townspeople's mortgages for years, and he'd left absolutely no mechanism for anyone to know it was him. She stood at that desk for a long time. Then she heard boots on the stairs and closed the ledger to its original page and moved to the kitchen to start the coffee. Because some things deserved to be discovered in privacy, and some truths about a person were better held gently at first, until you understood their full weight. Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "You were up early," he said. "I don't sleep well in new places." She poured a cup and set it on the counter without making it a gesture. "I walked through the main room. I hope that's acceptable. It's your house now." He said it, like a legal fact, not an invitation. He picked up the coffee and stood at the window. She watched his face in profile, the scar at his collar more visible in morning light, the set of his jaw that was probably fixed there even when he slept. He was carrying something. All 4 of them were. She could see the weight of it in the way they occupied space, always slightly braced, never quite at rest. "Tell me the schedule," she said. He glanced at her. "For the ranch. The daily work. I'd like to understand how things run before I start moving things around." Something in his expression shifted, barely. "You're not going to move things around. I'm going to keep the ledgers," she said evenly, "which means I will eventually have opinions about efficiency. Forewarning is a courtesy." He looked at her for a moment. Then, against what seemed like his better judgment, he almost smiled. "Breakfast at 5:30, he said. "Work begins at 6. She nodded. "I'll have breakfast ready at 5:15. He didn't argue. She counted that as a beginning. The other 3 came down in sequence. Jasper first, eyes quiet, greeting her with a nod that carried no awkwardness about last night's grief. He didn't know she'd seen him, and she had no intention of telling him. Thorne appeared with a cup of water in his hand, a cup she recognized as the one she'd left outside his door. He met her eyes across the room, held them for exactly a beat, then sat down without a word. Red arrived last and fully awake, coat already on, papers tucked under one arm. "Miss Hollister," he said, "you made biscuits." "I found flour," she said. "I've been here 3 years, and somehow there have never been biscuits before." "There's also coffee," she said. Rhett sat down and looked at Gideon. "I like her," he said simply. Gideon picked up his biscuit and said nothing. Over the following days, Maeve built her understanding of Timber Ridge the same way she'd built every lesson plan she'd ever written methodically, paying attention to what was actually there rather than what she expected. She learned the territory of each man. Jasper worked dawn to dusk in the forge, speaking little, but always aware of her movements, always pausing to hold a door or shift a heavy load without being asked. Thorne disappeared into the tree line most mornings and returned with information about the surrounding land that he reported to Gideon in clipped, precise sentences. Rhett spread legal documents across the main table every evening and worked through them by lamplight, occasionally reading passages aloud to no one in particular. And Gideon watched her, not aggressively, not warmly, with the focused attention of a man trying to solve something, like she was a problem he hadn't fully categorized yet. She let him look. She had nothing to hide. On the 4th morning, she asked Jasper if she could use the old storage building at the northeast corner of the property. He looked up from the horseshoe he was shaping. "That building? It's sound. Good north-facing light, which matters for a classroom. I'd need the floor swept, a few rough benches built, and a proper door fitted." She paused. "I can ask someone else if you're occupied." He set down his hammer. "No," he said. Something moved through his expression, brief and private. "I'll build the benches." "I'll help with the door," Thorne said from behind her. She turned. She hadn't heard him approach. His face was neutral, but he was already looking at the building, measuring it with his eyes. "Thank you," she said. He gave her that single nod again, the one that was a complete sentence, and walked toward it to begin. She looked at the back of his head and thought about her father's insistence that actions were always louder, that real character didn't announce itself. It just quietly showed up and started working. These men were more decent than they knew. The classroom opened on a Tuesday. It wasn't much to look at. A swept wooden floor, 6 benches Jasper had built, with a precision that suggested he'd been thinking about it longer than 2 days. A writing board Rhett had sourced from somewhere in town without explaining how. A good door with clean hinges that swung without dragging, courtesy of Thorne, who had also, without being asked, fitted a latch that locked from the inside. Maeve had arranged her father's books along a shelf at the front. She'd written the date on the board in large letters. She'd brought in a wildflower from the creek bank in a tin cup. Then she sat down and waited to see who would come. 7 children appeared in the first hour. 3 from the Henderson Ranch, 2 from a homestead family whose name she learned was Pruitt, a girl of about 10 who arrived alone and gave her name as Sarah without volunteering any further information, and a boy named Kaya who arrived last, standing in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. He was perhaps 9 years old. His clothes were worn clean. He had dark, careful eyes that tracked everything in the room before he moved toward a bench and sat down quietly at the end of it, leaving space between himself and the other children. Maeve looked at him and smiled. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "Take whatever seat is comfortable." He looked at her steadily and didn't smile back yet, but he stayed. That was enough. She had been running the class for about 40 minutes, working through letters, working through numbers, letting the children find their footing before pushing them further when she heard the horse outside. The door opened without a knock. The man who filled the frame was thick-necked and red-faced, with the particular expression of someone accustomed to moving through spaces like he owned them. He scanned the room. His gaze landed on Kaya and hardened. "What in the hell is this?" he said. Not a question. Maeve stood up from where she'd been crouching beside Sarah's bench. She put herself between the man and the room. "This is a schoolhouse," she said.
"And there are children present, so I'd ask you to watch your language."
He looked at her like she'd materialized from thin air. "You the new Blackwood woman?" "I'm Maeve Hollister. This is my classroom." She kept her voice level. "Who are you?" "Dale Cutter. I run the Cutterland operation east of here, and I'm telling you right now, I don't care what kind of arrangement you made with Blackwood, you don't bring that boy in here with white children." The room had gone completely still. Every child was watching. Maeve was aware of that with every part of her. She took one step toward Cutter, not aggressive, deliberate. "Mr. Cutter," she said, "I'm going to be very clear with you, because clarity is what I do. Every human being is born with equal rights to live, learn, and be treated with dignity." She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice volume was what you used when you'd run out of better tools. Worth is measured by the character of one's heart, not the color of one's skin, not the depth of one's pockets. Cutter's face went a deeper red. "That is not how things are done in this valley. Then this valley is going to have to grow," she said, "because this is how things are done in this classroom. Every child who walks through that door will be taught. Every child will be respected. And if you find that arrangement unacceptable, that is entirely your right. But you'll need to find somewhere other than my doorway to feel that way." He stared at her. She held his gaze without blinking, without shifting her weight, without giving him anything to read as uncertainty. Cutter was the kind of man who had never been spoken to like this, by a woman half his size in a schoolhouse, on someone else's property, and she could see him calculating how far he was willing to push this, what it would cost him, whether she would back down if he waited her out. She would not. He looked past her at the children, then back at her. Then he turned and walked out. His boots hammered the steps going down. She waited until the sound of his horse faded before she turned back to the room. 6 faces looked at her with wide eyes. Kaya looked at her with something quieter measuring, recalibrating. She sat back down on the edge of her desk and picked up her chalk. "Where were we?" she said. "Fractions." Outside the building, she had not seen them, but all 4 men had been there. Jasper had been at the corner of the building replacing a bracket when Cutter rode up, and he'd gone still in the way, Large men go still when something requires restraint. His hands had tightened on the iron bar he was holding until his knuckles whitened. He had not moved. He had listened to Maeve's voice, clear and steady, through the thin wall, and slowly, deliberately, let his grip loosen. Thorne had been in the tree line with a clear sight line to the door. He'd had one hand on his rifle for the duration of the exchange. He removed it when Cutter left and stood very still for a long time, looking at the building. Rhett had his law books under his arm. He had arrived just in time to catch most of it, and he stood on the path with an expression that was equal parts legal admiration and something quieter. He would review the territorial statutes on public education access that evening. He already knew what they said. He wanted to write it down anyway. Gideon had been standing at the edge of the building's shadow. He had heard every word. He stood there after Cutter left, after the children's voices started up again inside, after Rhett walked away and Thorne lowered his rifle hand, and Jasper went back to his bracket with unusual care. Gideon stood with his arms at his sides and looked at the schoolhouse door. Maeve had walked in there this morning with chalk and wildflowers and 6 rough benches, and she had just stood her ground against Dale Cutter without a weapon, without backup, without raising her voice even once. She had simply told the truth like it was a wall she was willing to stand behind, and Cutter had run out of options and left. Gideon had fought men twice Cutter's size. He had held territory in blizzards and fistfights and legal disputes that dragged through 3 county courts. He understood force. He was not entirely sure he understood what he'd just watched. That afternoon, Jasper disappeared in the forge for 2 hours and emerged with a desk small, precisely made, with a smooth writing surface and 2 small shelves underneath. He carried it to the schoolhouse and set it at the front of the room without saying much, just placed it where it obviously needed to go and ran his hand once across the surface, checking for splinters. Maeve looked at it, then at him. "It's good wood," he said. His voice was careful cedar. "Won't warp in the cold." She put her hand on the surface beside his. "It's beautiful, Jasper." He nodded, stepped back, left before she could say anything else. That evening, Rhett sat beside her at the main table and opened a law book to a page he'd marked. Territorial Statute. 1872, he said. Public right to education. Doesn't specify exclusions. He tapped the page. Cutter doesn't have a legal leg to stand on if he tries to formalize his objection. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You already knew the law. My father was a school teacher. He spent 30 years arguing with people like Cutter." She turned a page in her father's ledger, scanning columns. "I also know the law doesn't stop people from doing illegal things. That's why I wanted all 4 of you to know what's happening here." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "What are you expecting?" "Cutter to try something else," she said. "Men like that don't stop. They just switch methods." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll be ready." She looked up from the ledger. Through the window, she could see the forge fire burning low, and Jasper's shape passing in front of it, moving and then stopping, moving and stopping. Working through something the same way, he worked through iron, heating it, bending it, trying to find the shape it was supposed to become. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Thorne settle into his room for the night. Quiet. No sound of a nightmare yet, though the night was young, and Gideon had not said a single thing to her about what happened at the schoolhouse. He'd sat through dinner without speaking more than necessary, passed the bread, declined seconds, and read by the fire until she went to bed. But he had looked at her, at one point when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She had been paying attention. She always was. His expression, in that unguarded moment, was not cold. It was not calculating. It was the expression of a man looking at something he didn't have a category for yet, trying to figure out where it fit in a world he thought he had already mapped. She gave him time. She was a patient woman. She came from a long line of teachers. They knew that understanding arrived at its own pace, and the worst thing you could do was rush it. The blizzard announced itself at dusk. Maeve had felt it coming before she saw it, a pressure drop that made the air go thin and strange, the horses growing restless in their stalls, an hour before the first flakes hit. She'd lived through Boston winters. She knew what weather felt like when it meant business. This was different. This was the kind of cold that didn't apologize. By the time supper was finished, the wind had built itself into something structural, a force pressing against the walls of the ranch house with enough weight that the timbers answered back. Snow drove sideways past the windows in dense, blinding sheets. The temperature was falling fast, and it wasn't stopping. Gideon sent Thorn to check the perimeter fencing. Jasper had already gone out to the barn to settle the livestock before the worst of it hit. Maeve cleared the table and was heating water for dishes when Red appeared in the kitchen doorway, coat half on, face tight. "Something's wrong," he said. She turned from the stove. "What Gideon just found?" "Tracks. Fresh ones, coming from the East Ridge. Someone's been on the property." She set down the pot. "Cutter? Ironclad men, most likely." He finished pulling on his coat. "Stay inside." She had every intention of doing exactly that. She was practical, not reckless, and she understood that the best thing she could do in this situation was keep the fire banked and the water hot and the lamps burning so these men could find their way back. She was standing at the north window, watching the snow when she saw it. A shift in the darkness at the far edge of the barn. An orange glow that was wrong. Too orange, too bright, too fast. Fire. She moved before she thought about it. Her coat was on the peg by the door, and she grabbed it running, shoved her feet into her boots without lacing them, and pushed out into the blizzard. The cold was a wall. The wind drove the snow into her face horizontally, blinding and merciless. She put her arm up and ran toward the barn, with her head down. Following the glow, the fire had caught the hay stored in the northwest corner of the structure. It was moving fast, climbing the wall with terrifying ease, and the heat it threw was enough to cut through the cold, even at distance. The horses were screaming. She could hear them above the wind, a raw, frantic sound that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to her feet. She got to the barn door and yanked it open. Smoke rolled out. She pressed her sleeve across her mouth and went in. The horses in the nearest stalls she could release on her own. She got 4 loose, pushed them toward the open door, watched them bolt out into the storm, where at least they would survive. But she could hear the mare, Jasper's prize mare, heavy with foal, in the back stall, and the fire was between her and the main door. There was a storm cellar beneath the barn, older than the barn itself, cut into the Montana earth, accessible through a hatch in the floor near the rear. It had been used for storing feed and equipment, not for horses, but the hatch was wide enough and the slope down manageable. She knew this because she'd cataloged the ranch on her first full day. Her father's voice in her head, steady as ever, observation first. Always, she got to the mare, got the stall unlatched. The animal was wild-eyed and trembling, but responsive Maeve kept her voice low and her hand on the horse's neck, steady, steady, leading her toward the rear hatch. She got it open, got the mare angled toward it. Then the roof caved. Not the whole roof, a section above the northwest corner, where the fire had burned hottest. It came down with a sound like the world splitting, and the collapse drove a wave of superheated air through the barn that made Maeve stagger, and then the snow-loaded outer wall gave with it, cascading ice and timber and debris over the cellar hatch. She was already halfway down. The mare made it through. The hatch came down above them. In the sudden, smoke-filtered dark, Maeve understood the situation quickly and without panic, which was the only useful way to understand dangerous situations. The cellar was intact. The mare was beside her. The debris above was blocking the hatch, but the structure was holding. The cold hit her next. Real cold, cellar cold, underground cold, the kind that came up through the earthen floor and the stone walls simultaneously. And then she heard the sound that changed everything. Water. Snowmelt from the burning roof, channeled by the collapse, beginning to seep through the debris, and pour down into the cellar in dark, freezing sheets. It was filling from below, too. The heat of the fire above had compromised something in the drainage, and water was pushing up through the floor. She put the mare in the far corner, the highest point. She stood in the rising water and pressed both hands flat against the hatch above her and pushed with everything she had. It didn't move. She pushed again, called out. The wind was too loud, the fire too loud, the storm too loud. She called again anyway, because giving up was not something her father had ever taught her. The water reached her knees. It was so cold it stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing, which was worse. She kept her voice working. She kept her hands on the hatch. She kept her eyes on the mare in the corner. She was thinking about the children, oddly, about Kaya sitting at the end of the bench, deciding whether to trust, about the cedar desk and what Jasper's hands must have looked like making it, about Gideon's ledger and all those paid mortgages and no signatures. Good people, she thought. They are good people. The hatch exploded open. Snow and smoke and night air fell in on her at once, and then hands, multiple sets of hands, reaching down, and voices. She heard Rhett first, sharp and directed, organizing. Then Thorne, somewhere above, calling angles. Then Jasper's voice, enormous with fear, cutting through everything. And Gideon, he came down, into the water, into the dark, not sending someone else. He got his arms around her, and she felt the heat of him against her frozen skin like a physical shock. And he lifted her, and the other men pulled, and she came up out of the cellar and onto the frozen earth, with the blizzard still driving snow across everything. Gideon went to his knees with her. He pulled her against his chest, his arms locked around her, pressing the warmth of his body against clothes, so saturated they were rigid with cold. His hands moved across her shoulders, her arms, her face checking and shaking. She realized distantly that his hands were shaking. She heard his voice above her, raw in a way she had never heard from him, stripped of every layer he usually kept in place. Damn it. She is so wet. His voice cracked on the last word. Her body is ice cold. Jasper, get the fire going now. So wet. Jasper's voice, stunned and horrified, already moving. So wet, Thorne repeated, barely above a breath, from somewhere to her left. She heard him moving fast. God, she's so wet. Gideon Rhett was beside them, his coat already off his back and coming around her shoulders. They moved like one thing after that. Jasper had the fire in the ranch house built into something serious. In under 4 minutes. She would learn this later, would learn that he had torn apart a crate with his bare hands to get the kindling fast enough. Thorne appeared with every blanket in the house, organized with the efficiency of a man who had managed casualties in the field. Rhett boiled water, brewed something, kept talking in a low, steady voice, not to her exactly but near her, keeping the air filled with sound because silence was the wrong thing. Gideon did not leave her side. He sat on the floor beside the fire, with Maeve pulled against him and stayed. The shaking in his hands took a long time to stop. She was aware of it. She didn't comment. She understood that what was moving through him right now was not something that wanted to be named. The mare was recovered safely from the cellar by Jasper an hour later, unhurt, and he sat with her in the repaired stall for a long time afterward. Nobody asked him why. Nobody needed to. Gradually, slowly, feeling came back into Maeve's hands and feet, in the form of pins and needles, and then actual pain, which was a relief. Pain meant circulation. Pain meant she was all right. Around 2 in the morning, Rhett brought her tea she didn't remember asking for. She took it. The fire snapped, the blizzard howled outside with slightly less conviction. The barn? She asked. Northeast section is gone, Gideon said. His voice had come back to its usual register. But only just. The rest is standing. We'll rebuild in spring. The mare? Jasper's with her. Maeve nodded. She looked into the fire. It was deliberate, she said. The fire. Yes. Ironclad. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then it's going to get worse before it gets better. Gideon looked at her, not with the calculating assessment she was accustomed to from him. Something different. Something he reeled back in quickly when he realized she was watching. Probably, he said. She finished her tea. Then we'd better be ready. She went to bed somewhere close to 3 o'clock and lay in the dark, listening to the blizzard winding down outside, and thought about what it meant that Gideon Blackwood had gone into the dark and the cold and the water without hesitation. Thought about what it meant that all 4 of them had. People showed you who they were in emergencies. They couldn't help it. The layers came off, and what was underneath either held or it didn't. All 4 of them had held. She pulled her blankets, plus 3 borrowed ones up to her chin and closed her eyes. Outside, a light still burned in the forge. 3 days after the fire, Gideon told her about the land office appointment. They were at the breakfast table, the 5 of them for once, all present, all quiet, and he laid it out plainly the way he did everything. No preamble, no softening. County land office in Black Moccasin. End of the week. There's a water rights dispute that's been brewing for 2 years, and the ironclad syndicate has been pushing to have the valley's water claims reassigned. Rhett and I are going in to formally contest. Maeve looked up from the ledger she'd been reviewing. I'd like to come. Gideon looked at her. It's a legal proceeding. I know what it is. My father's maps cover this valley in detail. If there's a dispute about water claims, there may be survey information in his documents that's relevant. Rhett set down his coffee. He and Maeve had spent several evenings over the past week with her father's journals, working through notations that she'd initially taken for academic survey observations. Rhett had started to think otherwise. She's right, Rhett said. I've been looking at Robert Hollister's boundary work. He wasn't just mapping terrain, he was documenting water source origins, flow lines, drainage basins, original claim markers. He paused. If what I think is in those journals is actually there, it's significant. Gideon looked between them. How significant? Enough to bury the syndicate's claim entirely, Rhett said, if the data is solid. Maeve opened the trunk. She had kept it close since arriving, had gone through its contents methodically, but the maps layered between the books, in a false bottom she'd discovered only 4 days ago, had revealed their depth slowly. Her father's handwriting was cramped and detailed and coded in a shorthand she'd been deciphering with Rhett's help. She spread the clearest of them on the table. Gideon looked at it for a long time. His finger traced one of the marked flow lines, moved to a notation in the corner, moved back. Your father made this, he said. Yes. When? The dates run over about 18 months. He was in this valley before he went back to Boston. She paused. Before he died, Gideon raised his eyes to hers. He was here and you didn't know. I didn't know. She kept her voice even. He told me he was conducting survey work for an Eastern land company. He never said where. He never said. She stopped, pressed her fingers flat on the map. He never said what he found. The land office in Black Moccasin was a low-ceilinged building that smelled of old paper and damp wood. The county clerk, a small cautious man named Briggs, was already sweating when they arrived, which was not a good sign. 2 ironclad representatives were present sharp-dressed men who introduced themselves with names that didn't matter because they were clearly vehicles for someone else's agenda. Their lawyer was polished and unhurried, which was the manner of men who believed they had already won. Maeve sat beside Rhett at the respondents' table with the survey maps in her father's trunk at her feet. The proceedings opened with the syndicate's claim that the original water rights documentation filed on the valley's primary river source was invalid, that their own survey superseded all prior claims, and that the Blackwood Ranch and surrounding homesteads had therefore been operating on syndicate water illegally for 7 years. It was articulate. It was detailed. It was, as far as Maeve could tell, within about 12 minutes, built entirely on forged documents. Rhett saw it too. She could tell by the particular quality of his stillness, the controlled focus that came over him when he was processing something quickly. He presented the counter-arguments methodically. Original filing dates, chain of title, 3 separate territorial statutes. He was good. He was very good, actually, and she filed that away with admiration. Then the syndicate lawyer produced a new document. He laid it on the clerk's table with the careful deliberateness of a man playing his best card and knowing it. A sworn deposition, he said, from 2 witnesses who will attest that Miss Maeve Hollister was contracted by Ironclad Mining 6 months prior to her arrival at Timber Ridge Ranch. That her presence here is not that of a mail-order bride, but of a corporate operative sent to recover survey documents and property maps belonging to the syndicate documents currently in her possession. The room went very quiet. Maeve sat completely still. Rhett's pen had stopped moving. She became aware of Gideon to her. left aware of the moment his posture changed, a tightening so controlled it would have been invisible to anyone not paying close attention. She was paying close attention. She was always paying close attention. And what she saw moving through him in that moment was not anger. It was the particular devastation of a man who had been deceived before and had sworn he would not be again. "That is false," she said. Her voice was steady, every word of it. The syndicate lawyer smiled politely. "We have signed statements." "You have forged statements," Rhett said sharply, "which I will contest in detail." "Briggs," the lawyer addressed the clerk, "the documents in Miss Hollister's possession should be held as potential evidence in a corporate misappropriation case." Briggs, sweating harder, looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the documents on the table. He looked at the syndicate men, composed and confident. He looked at Maeve. She met his eyes. She had nothing to hide. She had never had anything to hide, and she held his gaze and waited for him to see that. But she could see what was happening behind his eyes. She could see the grief in there, old and deep and armored, and the years of learning that trust was how you got people killed, and the voice that was telling him right now that he had let someone pass the perimeter. And look at what happened. He looked away first. Outside the land office, the real blow came. A rider arrived at a hard gallop, pulling up in front of the building with the urgency of bad news that had been riding hard to catch someone. He found Gideon on the steps and delivered it in 3 sentences. Thorne had been ambushed on his return circuit of the east perimeter shot. He was at the ranch alive, and Jasper was with him. Maeve felt the impact of those words the way you feel a step that isn't there, the sudden drop, the instinctive reach for something solid. She turned to Gideon. His face had gone to stone. He looked at her, and she watched him do the calculation. She'd been dreading the accumulated weight of everything in that room, the forged accusations, the timing of the ambush, the maps in her trunk. She watched him build the case against her the way exhausted. Wounded men build cases against things they fear, using pain as mortar. He moved to the wagon. He lifted the trunk, her father's trunk, the books and the maps and the false bottom, and put it in the wagon bed. His jaw was set. His hands were controlled. He turned to her. "Get in the wagon," he said. She did. She said nothing on the ride back. Neither did Rhett. Though his silence had a different quality, she could see him working, running arguments, looking for the thread that would unravel the syndicate's case. He was on her side. She knew that. It steadied her more than she let show. Thorne was pale and quiet in his bed. When they arrived, Jasper at the chair beside him, a cloth pressed to his side. The wound was serious, but not fatal. Thorne met her eyes when she came to the doorway and gave her the same single nod he always gave her, unchanged, and she had to look away because of what that cost him right now. Gideon came to stand in the main room after he'd seen Thorne. He stood with his back to her for a long moment. Then he turned. "You need to go," he said. She had prepared herself for this. She had felt it building since the land office, had seen the exact moment he'd decided, and she had spent the entire ride home preparing herself. It did not help as much as she'd hoped. "Gideon, the trunk stays." His voice was flat and terrible. "You go." Rhett stepped forward. "Gideon, listen. Stay out of it, Rhett." A warning in his voice that was also a plea. Maeve looked at him. She let herself look at him fully, without flinching, without anger, because she was not angry. She was heartbroken. But heartbreak and anger were different things, and she knew the difference. "All right," she said. She got her coat. She got her bag, the small one she'd carried on the train, the one with $43 and her mother's photograph and a single book of her father's. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. "I will return," she said. Her voice held. "And I will prove you wrong." She walked out into the blizzard's aftermath, the world gray and frozen and brutally still. And she kept walking, because her father had taught her that when the ground was taken from under you, you kept your feet moving. You didn't wait for solid earth to appear before you took the next step. You took the step and trusted the earth to be there behind her. The ranch door stayed closed. Ahead, the mountain offered nothing but cold and distance, and the long, difficult work of being right when no one yet believed you. She walked anyway. The abandoned cabin was 3 miles northeast of Timber Ridge, up a switchback trail that the snow had tried its best to erase. Maeve found it by memory. She had seen it marked on one of her father's maps, a trapper's shelter, stone foundation, south-facing, likely sound. He had noted it with the same careful precision he applied to everything. Structure intact as of survey date, roof serviceable, interior dry. He had been right. Her father was almost always right about the things he wrote down. She got the door open with her shoulder and stood in the dark interior for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. Stone walls. A rusted iron stove in the corner with a small stack of old wood beside it. A rope caught against the far wall. Someone had left a tin of matches on the windowsill, and she crossed to them immediately because warmth was the first priority. Warmth before grief. Warmth before fury. Warmth before anything else. She got the stove going. Then she sat on the floor in front of it with her bag in her lap and her father's book in her hands, and she let herself feel it for exactly 5 minutes, the whole weight of the last hour. Gideon's face, the flat, terrible certainty in his voice, the door staying closed. 5 minutes. Her father's rule, borrowed from a Stoic philosopher she'd been reading since age 12. You allow yourself 5 minutes to feel the full force of it. Then you get up and you work the problem. She got up and worked the problem. The survey journals were in her memory more than her hands. At this point, she and Rhett had spent enough evenings with them that she could reconstruct the key sections with reasonable accuracy. She had a pencil and the back pages of the small notebook she always carried. She began writing out what she remembered, the flow line notations, the original claim markers her father had located, and cross-referenced against the syndicate's falsified survey dates. The water source documentation that predated Ironclad's presence in the valley by 11 years. Her father had not been doing academic survey work. He had been building a case, quietly, methodically, the way a schoolteacher builds a lesson not for the dramatic reveal, but for the moment when the student finally understood something true. He had been documenting fraud. He had been exposing how the Ironclad Syndicate had forged land deeds and manipulated water rights records across the entire valley, stealing from homesteaders and ranchers and indigenous families who had been there long before the syndicate decided the land was worth taking, and it had gotten him killed. She pressed her pencil harder into the page. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind was picking up again. He had hidden the maps in her trunk because he knew she would come west eventually, because he trusted her to find them and understand them and do something about it. He had left her the trunk and the debt and the marriage contract and the mystery, and he had trusted her completely. She was not going to waste that. She worked through the night. The stove required feeding every few hours, and she managed it mechanically, rising and adding wood, and returning to her notes without fully breaking her concentration. At some point, she ate the last of the biscuits she'd had in her coat pocket, absently barely tasting them. Sometime before dawn, she put her head down on the notebook and slept for 2 hours, dreamless and absolute. She woke to the sound of horses. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, moving to the window, looking out at the gray pre-dawn light. 2 horses coming up the trail fast, riders leaning forward. She recognized Rhett's coat first. Then Jasper behind him, enormous in the saddle, his breath and the horse's breath making the same cloud in the cold air. She opened the door before they reached it. Rhett dismounted and came up the steps and stopped when he saw her face. He had been prepared to search the cabin. He had not been prepared to find her standing at the door, with 2 pages of reconstructed survey notes in her hand and ink on 3 of her fingers. "You're all right," he said. Relief moved through his voice like something physical. "I've been working," she said. "Come in. I need to show you something." Jasper came through the doorway and had to duck for the lintel, and he stood in the center of the small cabin and looked at her with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. Just a man who had been genuinely frightened and was genuinely relieved. "Maeve," he said, just her name, but his voice made a complete sentence of it. "Jasper. Is Thornstable. Fever broke this morning. He's going to be all right." He paused. "We found something. That's why we came." Rhett had already pulled the letter from his coat. He held it out to her. It was a single folded page, the paper old but well preserved, the handwriting measured and deliberate and achingly familiar. Her father's handwriting. She read it, standing by the stove with the light of the fire on the page. Rhett and Jasper stood back and gave her room for it. It was a letter addressed to no one specific to whoever finds this. Her father had written at the top, with the calm practicality of a man who understood he might not survive what he was doing. He laid it out simply: the syndicate's fraud, the forged deed records, the original water rights that legally belonged to the valley's settlers, his survey documentation, where he had hidden copies, and, at the bottom, 2 lines that made her throat close. My daughter knows nothing of this. She is innocent of any connection to these men. If something happens to me and she has come west, protect her. She carries the evidence without knowing it. She is the most honest person I have ever known. Rhett was watching her. He had already read it, she could tell by the set of his face. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "Inside the lining of the trunk." His voice was careful. "Gideon found it after you left." She looked up. "He came to us about an hour after you walked out," Jasper said. "He'd torn the trunk apart, looking at everything. Found the letter in the lining." He paused. "He's Maeve. He's not good." She folded the letter, held it in both hands. "He sent you," she said. "We volunteered," Rhett said. "He's back at the ranch with Thorne. But yes, he knows he was wrong." A pause. "He said to tell you that." "Exactly that." She was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Somewhere outside a bird called once and went silent. "We need to go back," she said. "I have most of the survey data reconstructed from memory. Combined with the letter, Rhett, I think we have enough." "We have more than enough," he said. She picked up her bag and her notes and her father's book. She looked around the small cabin, the stove still burning, the rope cot undisturbed, the tin of matches back on the windowsill where she'd found it, left for the next person who needed it. She followed them out into the cold gray morning. The ride back to Timber Ridge took 40 minutes. When they came through the gate, Gideon was standing on the porch. He had the look of a man who had not slept. His coat was on, but not fastened, his jaw rough with 2 days of growth, and he was standing very still in the way she had come to recognize, braced, waiting, not quite knowing what he was waiting for. She dismounted and walked to the porch steps. He came down 1 step, then stopped. "Maeve." His voice was stripped of its usual control, rough at every edge. "I was wrong." A pause. "What I did sending you out, I was wrong." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "you were." He accepted that without flinching. "I want to tell you something," she said. "About trust." She kept her voice even, because this was important and important things deserved clarity. Unfounded suspicion is a cruel weapon. It doesn't just hurt the person it's aimed at. It destroys dignity, yours and theirs both. To truly respect someone means believing in who they are. She paused. "Not blindly. But it means not surrendering to malicious gossip the moment someone uses it against you." He held her gaze through all of it. He didn't look away. "I know," he said. "Good." She moved past him up the steps. "Now let me see Thorne, and then we need to start preparing for what comes next." Behind her, she heard him exhale, long and slow. She didn't look back, but she heard Jasper's quiet voice from the yard. "I told you she'd come back." And Gideon, barely audible, "I know you did." The town hall of Black Moccasin had not been used for a public gathering since a flood relief meeting 3 years prior, and it showed the benches were dusty. The ceiling leaked cold air from a gap above the east window, and the iron stove in the corner required serious persuasion before it agreed to heat the room. Rhett had spent 5 days preparing. He had filed the formal petition with Clerk Briggs, who sweated through the entire transaction but did not refuse, because Rhett presented it with the calm precision of a man who had memorized every relevant statute and was prepared to cite them in sequence if necessary. He had written out the evidence in triplicate, sourced 2 independent witnesses from surrounding homesteader families, and organized the survey documentation into a presentation that could be followed by anyone in the room, regardless of education. He had also quietly sent word to the surrounding community. They came. By the time the hearing opened on a gray Thursday morning, the town hall was full. Homesteader families in their best worn coats, mining families who had been quietly poisoned by the syndicate's water tampering and had only recently connected their ailments to the source. 3 families from the indigenous community to the north who had claims on this valley that predated every surveyor's map in the room. A widow named Cora Mills, who Maeve recognized from Gideon's ledger, sitting in the second row with her hands folded and her chin up. Maeve sat at the front beside Rhett, with her reconstructed notes and her father's letter, and the original survey maps that Gideon had restored to her without ceremony the morning after. She returned, simply placing the trunk. Outside her door, the latch closed, no note required. Gideon, Jasper, and Thorn were in the room. Thorn had insisted on coming, despite still moving carefully, and nobody had argued because arguing with Thorn was a project that yielded poor results. He sat along the side wall with his rifle across his knees, not because he expected to use it, but because he was Thorn, and that was how he sat in public spaces. Rhett opened the hearing with the precision of a man who understood that truth needed architecture to be heard properly. He laid the foundation first, the original water rights filing, dated and witnessed, predating the syndicate's presence in the valley by over a decade. He presented the survey documentation in sequence, walking the room through her father's methodology, explaining what each notation meant in plain language, because the people in this room deserved to understand the evidence that concerned their own lives. Maeve watched the faces as he spoke. She watched people begin to understand the moment when abstraction became personal, when water rights claim became the well that's been making my children sick. She watched anger kindle, and then importantly, focus, not into chaos, into clarity. The syndicate's representatives arrived 20 minutes late, which was a tactical error that Rhett had privately anticipated. It made them look exactly as arrogant as they were. Their lawyer moved immediately to discredit the survey documentation, citing the same forged counter-survey they'd presented at the land office. He was smooth. He had done this before, in other rooms, with other communities. He knew how to make legitimate evidence sound questionable and questionable evidence sound legitimate. Rhett let him finish. Then he produced the letter. He read the relevant sections aloud, clearly, in a voice calibrated to reach the back of the room. He explained who Robert Hollister was, what he had found, why he had hidden it, what it had cost him. The room was very quiet. Then Rhett presented the syndicate's own internal survey, cross-referenced against her father's original documentation, and showed point by point, marker by marker, exactly where the dates had been altered and the boundaries redrawn. He had prepared overlays on paper that even Briggs, sweating in the corner, could follow. "This is forgery," Rhett said. His voice was calm and absolute, documented, demonstrable, and criminal under territorial law. The water rights of this valley have never lawfully belonged to ironclad mining. They belong to the families in this room. That was when the syndicate men moved. 2 of them hired muscle, positioned near the door, which Thorn had noted upon arrival and had already accounted for. A 3rd man near the front, who stood and drew his weapon and said something loud about the proceedings being over. He didn't get to finish the sentence. Gideon moved from the right, Jasper from the left. Thorn, despite his wound, was on his feet and across the room before the man nearest the door completed his reach for his holster. It was over in seconds. Not violently, or rather, with the specific controlled economy of men who were very good at force and had chosen not to deploy it lethally. Weapons were removed, wrists were held. The 3 syndicate men found themselves standing disarmed and off balance in front of a room full of witnesses, with Gideon's hand on the nearest one's collar and Jasper's presence behind the second, making further resistance obviously pointless. No shots fired. Clerk Briggs was on his feet. His face had gone from sweating to pale. "These men," Rhett said to the room, still at his table, still composed, "have just committed armed intimidation in a public legal proceeding. That is a territorial felony." He looked at Briggs. "The record will reflect that." Briggs wrote it down. His hand shook slightly, but he wrote it down. And that, Maeve thought, was something a small man in a difficult position choosing the right side when it mattered. The aftermath took hours. Legal proceedings always did. But the shape of it was clear. By midday, the syndicate's claim was formally rejected. The fraudulent documentation was entered into the criminal record, and 3 of their men were in custody, awaiting the territorial marshal. Maeve stepped outside when it was done. The air was sharp and cold, and the sky above, black moccasin, was that particular winter blue that meant clear weather holding. She stood on the steps and breathed it in. Cora Mills came out behind her and stopped beside her on the steps and looked at the same sky. "Your father came through this valley about 2 years ago," the older woman said. "Stayed 3 weeks, measured everything, talked to everyone." A pause. "I didn't know what he was doing at the time. I do now." Maeve looked at her. "He was a good man," Cora said. "Yes," Maeve said. "He was." They stood together for a moment in the cold. Gideon appeared in the doorway behind her. He stopped there, not interrupting, and she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, that particular quality of his presence, the gravity of it. He waited until Cora had gone back inside. "Rhett says the criminal referral to the marshal should take 2 to 3 weeks, he said. "That sounds right. You knew this would work." She considered that. "I knew the evidence was sound. Evidence doesn't always work, but it's always worth presenting," she looked out at the street, at the valley beyond the rooftops, at the mountains beyond that. "My father believed that. He died believing it." She paused. "I think he was right." Gideon was quiet for a moment. She could feel him working toward something, turning it over, measuring it. "He taught you well," he said finally. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. She turned to look at him. His face in the winter light was less guarded than she'd ever seen it. The scar at his collar, the gray eyes that were not cold, she had decided, but careful. There was a difference. "He did," she said. "The best thing anyone can do for another person is teach them to think, to question, to keep looking for the truth even when it's inconvenient." She held his gaze. "That's what he gave me." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and it was not his usual clipped acknowledgement. It meant something larger. "Let's go home," he said. She walked down the steps beside him, into the cold, clean air, toward the wagon and the mountain. And the 4 men who had shown up in a room full of armed opposition and chosen, every one of them, to do the right thing. Home, she thought. Yes, that was exactly the right word for it now. The hot spring had no name on any map her father had made, but Maeve suspected he had found it anyway. The kind of man who measured every drainage basin and water source in a valley would not have missed this one, a cave carved into the mountain's belly by centuries of geothermal pressure, steam rising from the pool in soft, rolling clouds, the walls slick and ancient and glowing faintly amber in torchlight. Rhett had told her about it 3 days after the hearing. He'd been almost shy about it, which was not a quality she'd associated with him before. He said it was where they came sometimes. In the worst of winter, when the cold got into bones that had been broken too many times and needed something older than fire to put things right. She'd asked if she could see it. He'd looked at the other 3. Then back at her. "Yes," he said. That was all. The walk to the cave was 20 minutes up a trail that climbed the south face of the mountain, narrow and frost-edged at the sides, but clear in the center where boots had worn it smooth. They went single file. Gideon led. Maeve walked second. The other 3 followed without needing to be arranged. Inside, the temperature shifted immediately. The air was warm and dense with mineral steam, carrying the faint iron smell of deep water meeting hot stone. Torches in iron brackets lit the cave in amber light that moved and breathed the way firelight always did, finding every angle and shadow and making the stone walls look almost soft. The pool was larger than she'd expected, still dark at the center, lit at the edges by the torch glow. Steam moved across its surface in slow, unhurried currents. She stood at the edge and let herself feel it, the warmth pressing against her face, the complete absence of wind for the first time in weeks. Behind her, she could hear the 4 of them moving, hear the particular quiet that settled over them in this place. She understood, suddenly, why they came here. Some places hold the shape of peace. Not manufactured calm, not the absence of trouble, but actual peace, the kind that had taken long enough to build, that it had weight. This was that kind of place. She turned around. Gideon was watching her. His coat was off. The scar at his collar caught the torchlight, and she did not look away from it. She never looked away from things that mattered, and it mattered. Part of the man who had gone into dark, freezing water without hesitation to pull her out. Jasper sat at the edge of the pool with his boots already off, looking at the water with an expression she recognized, now that particular quiet he had when grief was present but not in charge. Thorn had found a flat ledge near the far wall and was seated on it, watching the steam rise with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for things worth waiting for. Rhett stood near the entry, arms loose at his sides, and for once he wasn't carrying anything. No books, no documents, just himself, which turned out to be more than enough. It was Gideon who moved first. He crossed the cave slowly without urgency and stopped in front of her. His eyes in this light were not gray the way winter was gray. They were the gray of mountain water over stone, deep and clear and running beneath everything. "You stayed," he said. "Not the hearing, not the valley." He meant here with them. "I told you I would," she said. "You did." He reached out and touched her face with one hand, the hand that had been shaking so badly the night of the blizzard, the hand that had pressed against her frozen skin and shaken with something too large for anger and too desperate for grief. It was steady now. She leaned into it. What followed was not a rush. It was the opposite of a rush. It had the quality of water, finding its level, inevitable, gentle, completely without force. They came to her the way men who had learned to be careful with things came to anything they finally allowed themselves to want, slowly, watching her face, giving her every moment to say no or step back. And she did neither, because she had made her own decisions all her life, and this one was easy. The pool was warm, warmer than she'd expected, the heat wrapping around her like something alive. Steam rose between them, blurring the edges of the torchlight, and she was aware of all four of them with a clarity that surprised her, not chaotic, not overwhelming, but like a chord. Individual notes that made something larger together. Gideon pulled her close from behind, his arms firm around her, his breath warm at her ear, and she felt his chest against her back, and the particular quality of a man who was choosing, for the first time in a very long time, to stop holding everything at distance. "God, Maeve." His voice was low and undone and entirely honest. "You are so wet." Jasper's voice came from her left, pressed against the curve of her shoulder, his enormous hands impossibly gentle on her arms. "So wet for us, my sweet angel." Thorn, at her right, breathed it against her throat, barely words at all. More like a confession he'd been working toward for weeks. "So wet for us, my sweet angel." Rhett, his mouth at her temple, laughing low and warm. "So wet for us, my sweet angel," and the laughter was not mocking. It was the laughter of a man so relieved and so present that it came out of him involuntarily, like something loosening. She laughed too. That was what nobody put in the stories, she thought. That joy and desire were not opposites of each other, that you could want someone and find them funny. That love in its truest form contained laughter as much as longing, and the longing was sweeter for it. She had spent her whole life believing that every human being deserved to be seen fully, not the parts that were useful or convenient or easy to love, but all of it. The scars and the nightmares and the grief carried in silence and the names written in children's primers and kept behind locked doors. All of it. She had believed it as an idea. Now she lived it. The steam rose around them in the amber dark, and outside the mountain, the valley lay still and cold, and waiting for spring. Spring did not arrive gently. It came the way most honest things came to Montana abruptly, without announcement, turning the frozen ground to mud overnight and filling the creek beds to bursting and covering every south-facing hillside in a wild, indiscriminate explosion of color that looked like the valley had been holding its breath since October and had finally let it out. Maeve stood at the schoolhouse door on the first morning that didn't require a coat and watched a red-tailed hawk circle above the pine line and thought about how different everything looked when the light was warm. The permanent schoolhouse had gone up in 3 weeks. That was the part that still surprised her when she thought about it. Not the building itself, though the building was better than anything she could have designed alone. A proper timber structure with 4 windows and a real plank floor and a door that fit its frame on the first try. What surprised her was how it had happened. The valley came. She had not asked anyone beyond the immediate community. She had mentioned it to Cora Mills after the hearing, and Cora had mentioned it to the Hendersons, and the Hendersons had mentioned it to 2 mining families on the North Road. And 3 weeks later, there were 17 people on the Timber Ridge property on a Saturday morning with tools and lumber and enough food to feed a crew twice the size. The Pruitt family brought their 4 oldest to help with the framing. 2 men from the indigenous families to the north arrived with the kind of practical carpentry knowledge that came from building structures meant to actually survive Montana winters, and the resulting wall joins were the most solid in the building. Jasper oversaw all of it with the focused calm of a man who had found the right use for his hands. He had opinions about the window placement and the roof pitch, and he voiced them plainly, without arrogance, and people listened because it was obvious he was right. He built the bookshelves last, working alone in the evening after everyone else had gone home, shaping each joint with a care that went beyond function. Maeve found him there one evening as the light was going. He had a small piece of cedar in his hand. Turning it over, and she recognized it as an offcut from the shelf boards, too small for anything structural. He was carving it into the shape of a horse. She sat down on a bench near him and said nothing. He kept working. The wood came down in fine curls around his knife, and the shape emerged from it, the way shapes emerged from men like Jasper slowly, with enormous patience, from the inside out. For Kaya, he said eventually. Not an explanation, just information. She looked at him. He'll love it. Jasper nodded. His hands kept moving. She thought about his daughter, whose name she had never spoken aloud and never would until he decided to speak it first. She thought about what it cost a person to love something that fragile and lose it. And she thought about what it meant that a man who had paid that price was still capable of carving a toy horse for a child he barely knew. That was the thing about grief that people got wrong, she'd decided. They thought it closed a person down. Sometimes it opened them, instead stripped away everything that wasn't essential and left only the part that knew what mattered. Thorne was healing slowly and thoroughly, which was exactly how he did everything. He had resumed his morning circuits of the property 2 weeks after the hearing, moving more carefully at first, favoring his right side, but by the end of March he was back to his full range and reporting to Gideon each evening with his usual clipped efficiency. He had started spending time at the school on Tuesday afternoons, not teaching sitting in the back, listening, with an expression she couldn't fully read. One Tuesday, he answered a geography question from one of the older children, and the answer was so precise and detailed that the room went quiet. After that, he came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Rhett finished the criminal referral documentation and sent it to the territorial marshal with a cover letter that Maeve had proofread and judged to be one of the most precisely constructed legal arguments she had ever read. He had been in correspondence with 3 other communities in the territory that the syndicate had similarly targeted, and there was talk of a collective petition that could accelerate the case significantly. He worked on it at the kitchen table most evenings, spreading papers across every available surface, and had developed a habit of reading passages aloud while she graded student work beside him. It was, she had thought once, a very companionable way to spend an evening. Gideon rebuilt the barn. He did most of it himself, starting at dawn and working past dark, refusing help, except when the structural elements required more than 2 hands. Jasper assisted with the ironwork. Thorne sourced timber from the upper property. But the framing, the roofing, The new stall configurations that improved on the old ones, that was Gideon, working through something the way he worked through everything, with his body and his hands and a focus that excluded everything except what needed doing. Maeve brought him water and didn't make conversation about it. He accepted the water and didn't make conversation about it either. They were learning each other's language that way through proximity and small practical gestures, and the understanding that some things communicated better without words. One afternoon, she came to bring him water and found him standing inside the finished barn, just standing in it, looking at the new walls and the clean stalls and the hay stored dry and the door that hung straight. He had his hands at his sides. His face was unguarded in the way it only got when he thought he was alone. She set the water on the workbench and started to go. Maeve, she stopped. It's better than it was, he said. He wasn't talking about the barn. She turned around. He was looking at her directly, gray eyes in the afternoon light. Yes, she said, it is. Then, in the far corner of the barn, Jasper appeared with a length of mahogany over one shoulder, and the particular expression of a man who had a project he'd been thinking about for some time. He set the wood down. He measured it with his eyes. He ran his hand along the grain. Good wood, he said quietly, almost to himself. Won't warp, won't crack. He looked up at Maeve. Solid enough to last. She understood what he was building. She felt it somewhere behind her sternum, warm and full and entirely without grief. A crib, solid enough to last. She pressed her fingers to her lips and didn't say anything, because some things were too large and too right for words. The wedding was on a Saturday in late May, when the lupines were up across the lower meadow and the snow line had retreated to the peaks, and the sky above, Timber Ridge, was the particular blue that only existed at altitude deeper than sea level. Blue, the blue of air that had never been crowded. It was not the wedding she had imagined on the train ride west. She had not imagined one at all. In those weeks, she had been too busy being practical, which was generally the right approach to impossible situations. But this one had assembled itself over the preceding months the way most true things assembled themselves, not by plan, but by accumulation. Each small decision building on the last, until one morning you looked up and realized the thing was already there, waiting to be named. The whole valley came. Cora Mills arrived first, because she was the kind of woman who arrived first to things that mattered. The Pruitt family came with their children, the oldest of whom had been teaching the youngest to read, which was the best possible outcome of a classroom. The Henderson families, the mining families from the North Road. Kaya arrived with his grandmother, who had not come to any community event before, and who stood at the edge of the gathering with the careful dignity of a woman deciding whether to trust a thing, and by the time the ceremony began, she had moved 3 rows closer. Rhett had volunteered to speak the words. He was, he pointed out, technically ordained for frontier purposes, and he delivered this information with enough irony that it took a moment to realize he was completely serious. The ceremony was simple. Maeve had insisted on simple. Her mother's dress had been cleaned and altered a 3rd time, and it fit her properly now in a way it never had before, as if the dress had always been waiting for the right occasion to settle into its shape. Gideon stood facing her at the top of the meadow with the mountains behind him, and she thought again what she had thought on the train platform, that he looked like a man who had survived something terrible and come out hardened. She still believed that, but she knew now that hardened was not the same as closed. Rock was hard and water ran through it, patient and persistent, finding every crack. Jasper stood to Gideon's left, enormous and still, and wearing an expression that was not trying to be anything other than what it was. He had a wildflower in his coat pocket, a small blue one, the kind that grew along the creek bank, and he didn't explain it, and nobody asked. Thorne stood on the other side, straight despite the scar on his ribs that would pull at certain angles for the rest of his life. His hat was off, which was, for Thorne, a significant gesture. He was watching the valley below, with the attention of a man who was present in his life for the first time in a long time, and finding it habitable. Rhett stood at the center, his law books conspicuously absent for once, his expression carrying the particular warmth of a man who was genuinely happy and didn't feel the need to qualify it. Gideon took Maeve's hands. She had learned to read his silences. Months ago, learned the difference between the silence that was a wall and the silence that was a man organizing something too large for quick words. This one was the second kind. He held her hands, and he looked at her, and he took his time. "We used to believe," he said finally, "that guns and muscle were the only things that could protect this land." His voice was steady and deliberate in the way it always was, but underneath it, she could hear everything he was not accustomed to saying. "Everything we built here, we built from toughness, from force, from not letting anything pass the perimeter." He paused. "But Maeve, through knowledge, respect, and unconditional love, taught us what it truly means to be human." The words had the quality of something he had been thinking about for a long time, worked down to their truest form. A woman is not a property to be owned, but an equal partner to be cherished, respected, and loved. Silence across the meadow. The kind of silence a crowd produces when something true has been said, and they are letting it land. Rhett stepped forward with the ring. It was copper, hand-forged, warm from being in Jasper's pocket since morning. Simple and precisely made. Built to last, Gideon placed it on her finger. She held his gaze and thought about her father, about 30 years in a Boston classroom, about a trunk full of books and secret maps, about 2 lines at the bottom of a letter: "She is the most honest person I have ever known." She thought about what it meant to pass something down. Not property, not money, not the kind of inheritance that could be stolen or forged or contested in a land office. Something else. The belief that truth was worth documenting, that dignity was worth defending, that every child sitting at a rough-hewn desk deserved to be told that their mind mattered and their life mattered, and that the person telling them this was not performing awkwardness, but simply acknowledging a fact. That was what he had given her. That was what she had brought West in a muddy wedding dress, with $43 and a trunk full of books, and it turned out to be exactly enough. She looked out past Gideon's shoulder at the valley below the schoolhouse, visible from here, its new roof bright in the morning sun, the creek catching light along its banks, the lower meadow full of people who had driven or ridden or walked. To be here, she thought of Kaya sitting at the end of the bench on the first day, deciding whether to trust. She thought of a mahogany crib taking shape in a blacksmith's hands. She thought of a man who paid off strangers' mortgages in secret, and a man who sat in the back of a classroom on Tuesday afternoons, learning that his knowledge was something he could give, and a man who left a cup of water outside a nightmare door without being asked. She looked back at Gideon. "I know," she said. It answered everything he had said, and several things he hadn't. He almost smiled. Then he did smile, and it changed his whole face, and she filed it away the same way. She had filed away every important thing since she arrived carefully, completely, for keeps. All 5 of them turned toward the valley. The sun was fully up now, clear and warm and indifferent to ceremony in the best possible way, the way Montana was indifferent to everything vast and demanding and impossibly beautiful, asking only that you show up honestly and do the work. They showed up. They had been showing up for months. Maeve held Gideon's hand on her left and Jasper's hand on her right. And somewhere behind her, Rhett and Thorne were doing the same, and the 5 of them stood at the edge of the world they had made together, and looked at the light coming over the mountains. Below, the valley was free. The schoolhouse stood. The creek ran clean, and spring at last was fully here. There's a reason this story stays with you after it's over. It isn't the blizzard. It isn't the fire, or the frozen cellar, or the 4 men who tore open a collapsed hatch with their bare hands to pull one woman out of the dark. Those moments are unforgettable, yes, but they aren't the point. The point is what Maeve Hollister carried into that valley and what she refused to put down, even when everything was taken from her. She arrived with $43, a trunk full of books, and a signed contract with a man who told her, on the very first day, that there would be no romance and no touching. She arrived with mud on her mother's wedding dress and debts she hadn't earned, and a grief she hadn't finished with yet. By every reasonable measure, she had nothing. And she walked into that frontier town like she owned the ground under her feet, not because she was fearless, but because she understood something. Most people spend their whole lives trying to learn that dignity is not something the world gives you. It is something you decide to keep, no matter what the world does. She opened a schoolhouse. Not for the children who were easy to teach, not for the ones whose presence wouldn't cause trouble. For all of them. For the boy who stood in the doorway, deciding whether the room was safe. For the child whose parents worked the mines. For the families who had been told for years that knowledge wasn't meant for people like them. She stood in front of a man twice her size, who walked into her classroom with hatred on his face, and she did not raise her voice. She simply told the truth, clearly, like a wall she was willing to stand behind, and he ran out of room and left. That is what education actually looks like. Not a building, not a curriculum. A person who believes without reservation that every human mind is worth developing. That worth is not inherited or purchased or assigned by birth. That the most radical act available to any of us, in any era, is to look at another person and say, "You matter, and I am going to act like it." And then there are the four men, Gideon, Jasper, Thorn, Rhett. Men who had built their entire existence around force and endurance and never letting anything past the perimeter. Men who were carrying damage so old it had become architecture the shape their lives were built around. They had convinced themselves that hardness was safety. That distance was protection, that if nothing got in, nothing else could be lost. Maeve didn't argue with that. She didn't try to fix them or explain them to themselves. She just lived honestly in their presence, day after day, and let them see what it looked like when a person moved through the world with both strength and openness at the same time. She showed them that vulnerability was not weakness, that trust, real trust, was not naivety, it was a choice, and a courageous one, and it was the only thing that made genuine connection possible. She also showed them that when trust is broken, as Gideon broke it, catastrophically, on the worst night of the story, the right response is not self-pity, and it is not endless apology. It is accountability. You say, "I was wrong." You mean it. And then you do better. That's it. No performance. No grand gesture. You say the true thing, and you do the better thing, and you let that be enough. That is the story. That is what it means. And if any part of it landed, if you found yourself thinking about Kaya sitting at the end of that bench, or Gideon's hands shaking in the dark, or a copper ring forged simple and solid, and meant to last, then carry it with you. Let it ask you something. Let it change, even slightly, how you treat the next person you encounter who is standing in a doorway, deciding whether the room is safe. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and not intended to represent any real persons or historical situations.